There is a kind of person you have met before. You may not have been able to name what they possessed, but you felt it the moment they walked into the room. They didn't raise their voice when others panicked. They didn't crumble when the world pressed down on them. They looked at crisis the way a surgeon looks at an open wound, with clarity, steadiness, and absolute purpose. You thought they were cold, but you were wrong. They were free. Most people spend their entire lives trying to control the world around them. The opinions of others, the outcomes of their choices, the behavior of people who will never change. They exhaust themselves managing an empire they were never meant to rule. And yet, inside themselves, in the place where it actually matters, they remain completely unguarded. What if the real battle was never out there? What if the only frontier worth conquering was the one between your ears? The Stoics didn't ask you to become stone, they asked you to become steel. This is not a video about suppressing who you are. It is not about becoming cold in the way the world uses that word, detached, indifferent, cruel. This is about something far more difficult and far more powerful. It is about learning to feel deeply and choosing not to be ruled by what you feel. In this video, we are going to walk through 10 Stoic principles that will permanently change the way you think, react, and move through this world. Not 10 motivational quotes. 10 philosophies, forged in exile, tested in empire, and proven across 2,000 years of human suffering and triumph. The question is not whether your mind can be controlled. The question is, who is doing the controlling? Lesson 1. The discipline of assent. You are not your first thought. Before Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome, before he commanded legions, negotiated treaties, or sat at the center of the most powerful civilization in the ancient world, he was a student. And the idea that changed everything for him was deceptively simple. You are not obligated to believe the first thing your mind tells you. The Stoics called this the discipline of assent. It was the foundational act of all Stoic practice. An impression arrives, a sudden anger, a wave of fear, a flash of jealousy, and the untrained mind immediately accepts it as truth, as identity, as command. The Stoic pauses, the Stoic examines, the Stoic chooses whether to give that impression the power of consent. Your thoughts are not you, they are visitors. You decide which ones get to stay. Epictetus, the man who was born into slavery, had his leg broken by his master, and still became one of the most revered philosophers in history, taught this relentlessly. He called the faculty of judgment our ruling faculty. Our hegemonicon. Everything that matters, he said, begins there, not in the world, not in what happens to you, in what you decide to assent to. Think about the last time you said something you regretted in anger. That moment between the provocation and your response, that tiny gap, is the entire battlefield of Stoic philosophy. Most of us never even notice it exists. The emotion arrives, and we are already reacting, already burning, already apologizing later. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, what we now call the Meditations, a reminder he had to give himself over and over again. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wrote it not because he had mastered it. He wrote it because he was still fighting for it. Even the Emperor of Rome had to remind himself daily not to surrender his mind to his impulses. The most dangerous battlefield in your life has no geography. It exists entirely inside you. To become cold-minded like a Stoic does not begin with grand gestures or dramatic decisions. It begins in a single second. The second you realize that an impression has arrived, and you have not yet chosen whether to accept it. That pause is everything. That pause is the door to freedom. Lesson 2. Amor fati, the love of what cannot be changed. In the year 41 AD, the Emperor Claudius banished Seneca to the island of Corsica. Seneca had been one of the most celebrated minds in Rome, a writer, a playwright, an advisor to the powerful. And then, without warning, through political intrigue he may not even fully have understood, everything he had built was taken from him. He was sent to an island at the edge of the known world, away from his career, his reputation, his family, his purpose. He stayed there for 8 years, and in that exile, instead of collapsing, he wrote, he thought, he deepened. He emerged not as a broken man, but as a philosopher at the peak of his powers. Exile did not diminish Seneca, it revealed him. The Stoics developed a philosophy of fate that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. They called it amor fati, love of fate, not resignation, not passive acceptance, something far more difficult and far more powerful. The choice to not merely tolerate what happens to you, but to want it, to see in every obstacle, every loss, every injustice, the raw material of transformation. Marcus Aurelius expressed this with characteristic directness. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This was not poetry. This was his operating philosophy through plagues, famines, the deaths of children, military campaigns that exhausted both his armies and his spirit. He never had the luxury of a peaceful reign, and he chose, deliberately, to see each adversity not as something happening to him, but as something happening for him. The Stoic does not ask, "Why is this happening to me?" The Stoic asks, "What is this making me?" This is one of the hardest lessons in Stoic philosophy because it runs directly against every instinct we have. When something painful arrives, we resist it. We fight it. We demand that the universe explain itself, and in that resistance we suffer twice, once from the event itself, and once from our refusal to accept it. Cold-mindedness is not the absence of grief when loss arrives. It is the refusal to let grief become your permanent address. It is the ability to feel the full weight of what has happened and still say, "This is the path. I will walk it. I will build with these stones, even the sharp ones." Lesson 3. The view from above. Perspective as a weapon. Marcus Aurelius had a meditation practice that sounds almost otherworldly in its ambition. When he felt consumed by urgency, when the palace intrigues felt suffocating, when the demands of empire felt like they would crush him, he would perform what scholars call the view from above. He would mentally ascend, pulling his perspective higher and higher until the problem that had seemed enormous became visible in its true proportion. He wrote, "Look down from above on the countless herds of people and their countless rituals, and every kind of voyage in storm or calm, and the disputes between those being born, living together, and dying. Think also of the life lived by others long ago, and of the life that will be lived after you, and the life being lived now in other places." He was not escaping. He was calibrating. When everything feels urgent, nothing is truly seen. Perspective is not a luxury, it is a survival tool. Epictetus taught a version of this through his concept of what he called the dichotomy of control. There are things within our power, he said, and things outside of it. Within our power, our judgments, our intentions, our responses, our character. Outside our power, the opinions of others, the behavior of the world, the body, reputation, property. The moment you genuinely understand this division, not as an idea but as a lived reality, you stop being enslaved by the half of existence you were never meant to control. Think of the things that have consumed your energy this past month. How many of them were things you could actually change? How many were simply events that required your presence but not your panic? The view from above does not make you indifferent to the world. It makes you accurate about it. The untrained mind treats every wave as a catastrophe. The Stoic knows the difference between a storm and weather. The emperor of Rome, surrounded by the machinery of absolute power, still had to remind himself to zoom out, still had to remember that the empire and all its drama was a brief ripple in a vast, indifferent universe. Not because the work didn't matter, but because that perspective is precisely what allowed him to do the work without being destroyed by it. Lesson 4. Premeditatio malorum, the courage to imagine the worst. Seneca wrote one of the most counterintuitive instructions in all of philosophy. Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. He was not advocating for morbidity. He was advocating for clarity, the kind of clarity that only arrives when you stop pretending that loss is something that happens to other people. The Stoics practiced what they called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Every morning a Stoic might deliberately visualize the things they feared losing, the relationship ending, the career collapsing, the health declining, not as a prophecy, but as an inoculation. If you have already walked through the worst in your mind, the worst loses most of its power over you. The thing you refuse to think about owns you more completely than anything you face with open eyes. This practice sounds brutal, and it is, initially. But consider what happens when you never practice it. You build your entire emotional architecture on the assumption that what you have will last. And then, because nothing lasts, when the loss comes, as it always does, you are utterly unprepared. The grief is compounded by the shock. The pain is doubled by disbelief. Seneca himself was ultimately forced to take his own life on the orders of Emperor Nero, the same man he had tutored, the same man he had devoted years of his life to guiding toward virtue. He faced that moment with the composure of a man who had already, many times, prepared for exactly this kind of end. His wife tried to die with him. He urged her to live. Even in that final hour, he remained more concerned with the well-being of others than with his own survival. To prepare for loss is not to summon it. It is to ensure that when it comes, you are still standing. Cold-mindedness means you are not surprised by difficulty. Not because you are pessimistic, but because you are honest. You have done the hard work of imagining what could break, and that work has made you unbreakable. Not because you feel less, but because you have already felt it, in the quiet of preparation, where it cost you nothing but your illusions. Lesson 5. The Inner Citadel. Building the self that cannot be taken. There is a concept in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that modern readers often overlook because it sounds almost too simple. He called it the inner citadel. It was his name for the core of the self, the rational mind, the seat of judgment, the place that external events could not reach unless you opened the door and invited them in. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he wrote. But he also understood that this power had to be built. The inner citadel was not something you were born with in finished form. It was constructed, deliberately, through practice, through philosophy, through the daily discipline of examining your reactions and refusing to let the world write the story of who you are. Everything can be taken from you, except the person you have decided to be. That is the only possession that matters. Epictetus understood this at a level most of us never will. He was owned by another human being. His physical freedom was not his. His labor was not his. His time was not his. And yet, he was, by any philosophical measure, the freest man in Rome, because the one thing his master could never reach was his judgment, his will, his interior world. He said, "Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things." No one could take from him the quality of his own thought. The inner citadel is the opposite of what most people build. Most people build their identities outward, in achievement, in reputation, in how others see them, which means they live with the constant terror of that identity being dismantled. Every criticism is an attack. Every failure is an annihilation. Every social humiliation is an existential threat. If your identity lives in other people's hands, you will spend your life trying to control hands that were never yours to hold. The Stoic builds inward, virtue, reason, the quality of attention brought to every moment. These are things that cannot be taken by market crashes, broken relationships, failed ambitions, or the passage of time. The inner citadel is not a retreat from life. It is the place from which you engage life without being consumed by it. Lesson 6. Voluntary discomfort. Training the body to serve the mind. Seneca wrote a letter to his friend Lucilius, describing what he had voluntarily done that week. He had slept on a straw mat. He had eaten rough bread and olives. He had drunk plain water. He was one of the wealthiest men in Rome at the time. He did this not because he had to, but because he wanted to test something. He wanted to know with certainty whether his peace of mind depended on his comfort. He wrote, "It is not the man who has too little that is poor, but the man who hankers after more." But more than a philosophical statement, this was a practice. The Stoics regularly subjected themselves to voluntary hardship, cold baths, fasting, sleeping without luxury, specifically to discover that they could, specifically to strip away the anxiety that whispers, "What will happen to me if I lose this?" If you have never chosen to go without, you will spend your life terrified of losing what you have. This is not about punishment or asceticism for its own sake. The Stoics were not against pleasure. Seneca was surrounded by wealth and never pretended that comfort was evil. The point was mastery. The point was knowing, through direct experience, not theory, that your well-being did not live in your possessions, your pleasures, your status, or your routine. Marcus Aurelius, despite being emperor, was known for his Spartan habits. He slept on a simple soldier's bed during military campaigns rather than using the elaborate quarters prepared for him. He fasted periodically. He trained physically not for aesthetics, but for discipline. He understood that the emperor who could not live without his luxury was a hostage to that luxury. A man owned by what he owned. The Stoic trains for difficulty in peacetime so that difficulty cannot train him in crisis. Voluntary discomfort is not masochism. It is intelligence. It is the practice of expanding your baseline so that what breaks other people simply becomes weather to you. Cold-mindedness is not built in comfort. It is built in the deliberate decision to make things harder than they need to be, so that when the world makes things hard without your permission, you are already at home in the difficulty. Lesson 7. The practice of non-reaction. Silence as mastery. There is a moment in Roman history that deserves far more attention than it typically receives. In 177 AD, Marcus Aurelius was hosting public games when the crowds began to mockingly chant the name of one of his chariot drivers, implying that their preferences should determine imperial policy. The crowd was not small. It was tens of thousands of people, loud, mocking, testing. Marcus did not react with anger. He did not move to suppress them. He sat. He watched. He remained entirely still, and in his stillness he communicated something that no amount of imperial force could have matched. I am not moved by you, not because I am above you, but because my peace does not depend on your approval. The person who does not need to react is far more powerful than the person who cannot stop reacting. Epictetus was explicit about this. He said, "If a man has reported to you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make any defense to what has been told you, but reply, 'The man did not know my other faults, else he would not have mentioned only these.'" This is not weakness. This is the response of someone whose identity is so secure that the opinion of others cannot reach it. Most of us have been taught, implicitly, that silence in the face of criticism is weakness, that we must defend ourselves, correct the record, assert our dignity. But this instinct reveals something uncomfortable. We are willing to let the person who attacks us decide whether we feel humiliated. We hand them the controls and then wonder why we feel out of control. Every unnecessary reaction is a small surrender. Every deliberate silence is a small victory. The Stoic practice of non-reaction is not the same as suppression. It is not swallowing your feelings and pretending they don't exist. It is the deeper work of building an identity so rooted in virtue and reason that provocations simply don't find purchase. They arrive, you feel them, and then they pass, like weather across a mountain that has been standing for 1,000 years. Lesson 8. Sympathia. Cold mind, warm heart. This is the lesson that the modern misreading of Stoicism consistently misses. The Stoics believed in something they called sympathia, the idea that all human beings are connected by a shared rational nature, that the suffering of any person is in some fundamental way the suffering of all people. This was not a sentimental belief. It was a philosophical conviction with practical consequences. Marcus Aurelius, in the Meditations, returned again and again to our obligation toward each other. He wrote, "What injures the hive injures the bee." He wrote, "We are made for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of upper and lower teeth." The man who ruled an empire, who had every earthly reason to view people as instruments, chose instead to see them as kin. To become cold-minded is not to become cold-hearted. The two are not the same thing. They are not even close. This is the paradox at the heart of Stoic philosophy that most people never reach. The deeper your emotional mastery, the more genuinely you are able to care. When you are not consumed by your own reactivity, when you are not defending your ego, managing your anxiety, or performing for approval, you actually have the capacity to see other people, really see them, not through the filter of what they might give you or take from you, but as they actually are. Epictetus, who had been enslaved, did not teach his students to become indifferent to slavery's cruelty. He taught them to resist cruelty, to maintain their own dignity, and, crucially, to recognize the shared humanity even in those who had wronged them. His philosophy did not produce people who looked away from suffering. It produced people who could face suffering without being destroyed by it. The Stoic who has mastered himself is not cold toward the world. He is finally available to it. Becoming cold-minded means your emotions serve you, not the other way around, but the emotions themselves, the love, the grief, the compassion, the righteous anger at injustice, remain. They remain because they are human. The Stoics never asked you to stop being human. They asked you to stop being enslaved by your humanity. Lesson 9. Memento mori. Let death teach you how to live. In ancient Rome, when a general returned from conquest to a victory parade through the city, the crowds cheering, the soldiers marching, the spoils of war displayed for all to see, there was a tradition that has become one of the most striking images in all of history. A slave rode in the chariot behind the triumphant general, and the slave's one job was to whisper repeatedly into the general's ear, "Memento mori, remember that you will die, not as a threat, not as mockery, as a gift." The most important gift philosophy had to offer, the reminder that this moment of glory was temporary, that the body in the chariot would one day be in the ground, that the crowd's adoration was weather, not truth. Nothing sharpens the present moment like the honest acknowledgement that it will end. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme in the Meditations with a persistence that some readers find uncomfortable. He listed names, famous emperors, brilliant philosophers, celebrated generals, and noted that they were all gone. all of them, not eventually, gone, gone now. The earth had swallowed them without ceremony, and the world had continued its rotation as if they had never existed. He wrote, how many a Chrysippus, how many a Socrates, how many an Epictetus, how many a Plato, all have been swallowed by time. He was not being nihilistic, he was being surgical. If everyone eventually disappears, then the question of how to live becomes very specific. Not, how can I be remembered? But, what kind of person will I choose to be in the time I actually have? The man who has genuinely accepted his mortality is free from a dozen anxieties that terrorize everyone else. Memento mori is perhaps the most countercultural Stoic practice in the modern world. We have built an entire civilization around the avoidance of death's reality. We medicate it, cosmetically obscure it, narratively exile it to old age, and in doing so, we have made ourselves uniquely vulnerable to its logic. We make small compromises to avoid small discomforts, not realizing we are spending the currency of our one life on things that will not matter when the night arrives. The cold-minded person has done their reckoning with mortality, not once in a dramatic philosophical crisis, but regularly, quietly, honestly. And from that reckoning comes a clarity that no amount of success or distraction can manufacture. The clarity of someone who knows at a bone-deep level that today counts. Lesson 10. Virtue as the only good, the final transformation. This is the lesson that separates Stoic philosophy from every self-improvement system that has borrowed its language. Every other framework says virtue is important because it leads to success, happiness, good relationships, a meaningful life. The Stoics said something far more radical. Virtue is the only good, not a means to something else, the end itself. Marcus Aurelius spent decades asking himself one question above all others, in different forms across the Meditations. Am I acting virtuously right now? Not am I winning? Not are people impressed? Not will this benefit me? Am I acting as a rational, ethical being should act in this moment with what I have? The Stoics were not interested in your results, they were interested in your character. Epictetus made this terrifyingly clear in his Enchiridion, the handbook his students transcribed from his teachings. He wrote that if you wish to be a philosopher, prepare yourself from the very first to be laughed at and sneered at by many who will say, suddenly a philosopher has appeared among us. The path of virtue does not come with social rewards. It often comes with confusion, misunderstanding, and the loneliness of moving in a different direction from the crowd. And yet, Epictetus taught, this is precisely the point. The moment your virtue depends on external validation, on people noticing, on outcomes rewarding it, on the world returning what you have given, it has already ceased to be virtue. It has become a transaction, a performance, a sophisticated form of approval-seeking dressed in philosophical clothing. True virtue does not need an audience. It does not need a reward. It does not even need to be recognized. It simply needs to be practiced. This final lesson is where cold-mindedness finds its full meaning. A person who has internalized virtue as their only genuine goal is, in a very specific sense, impossible to manipulate. You cannot threaten them with failure. They are not primarily chasing success. You cannot seduce them with approval. They are not performing for the crowd. You cannot destabilize them with criticism. Their foundation is not built on reputation. They are cold in the way that a deep river is cold, not frozen, not lifeless, but moving with a power that is not disturbed by what happens on the surface. And they are human, genuinely, warmly, compassionately human, because they are no longer wasting their humanity on anxiety, performance, and the exhausting work of managing how they appear. The 10 lessons we have walked through tonight are not 10 separate ideas. They are one idea, seen from 10 different angles. They are all expressions of the same Stoic truth, that the quality of your life is determined not by what happens to you, but by the quality of the mind you bring to what happens to you. Becoming cold-minded does not mean losing your humanity. It means finally being free enough to express it. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire for 19 years while recording his private struggles with anger, grief, inadequacy, and doubt. He was not a man who had conquered his emotions. He was a man who had committed daily to the practice of not being ruled by them. He wept for the children he lost. He felt the weight of every decision. He carried the empire on a body that was failing throughout most of his reign, but he never stopped trying to be good. Epictetus taught students from a small bare room with no army, no title, no wealth, no physical freedom for most of his life. And yet the quality of his thought, the precision of his reasoning, the warmth of his humanity outlasted every emperor who tried to diminish it. Seneca wrote some of his most enduring philosophical work in exile, in poverty relative to what he had known, with the knowledge that his influence might never return. He kept writing anyway, not for an audience, for the truth of the practice itself. These men did not become cold. They became clear, and in that clarity they became something the world rarely produces, genuinely free. What you choose to do with these principles is yours entirely. That is, fittingly, the most Stoic thing about them. They cannot be forced on you. They cannot be performed for an audience. They can only be practiced, quietly, persistently, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life. In the moment when someone says something designed to humiliate you. In the moment when the plan collapses and panic arrives. In the moment when you could react, could retaliate, could surrender, and instead you pause, you breathe, you choose. That pause is where all of this lives. That pause is the entire inheritance of Stoic philosophy. That pause is where a person who was once controlled by their emotions becomes something older, quieter, and far more powerful. You do not have to become cold. You have to become free, and they are not the same thing, though from the outside they look remarkably similar. The world will always test you. The people around you will always have opinions. Circumstances will always move in directions you did not plan for. None of that will change. What can change, what the Stoics spent their lives insisting can change, is you. Not who you are, but who is in charge of who you are. That is the Stoic promise, and it is the only one worth making.